My name is Professor Mary Murphy. I'm in the Department of Sociology, and Patrick Wesleyan beside me is in the Department of Geography. And we're just sitting here to kick things off. It's not like it is a collective effort. Just some practical information. We're very happy people tweet and stuff like that, but obviously just mobile phone etiquette, and try not to let it interfere too much with the conference. I know a number of people are teaching or moving out to this, that, and the other. That's to be expected. So, you know, sit near exits and try not to disturb things too much, but more than welcome to come back. So, you know, don't feel awkward about coming and going. And we do have a couple of changes on the agenda. The first one is that Professor Rachel Msetfi, the Vice President for Research and Innovation here at Maynooth University, just cancelled out this morning because he has COVID, and that's a pity. But we're very pleased that the Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty for Social Sciences, Professor Audra Mukatasis, is online watching right now. So welcome, Audra, and hi. And that's really important in terms of being institutionally placed to bring it back into the university's strategic planning process. Thanks a million to Lucy, and particularly to Anne down there, who's putting us up on YouTube and recording everything online. So there will be a good online record of what we have, which the university can look at as well. And that's really important. We've also got Ora behind. We've got the beginning of a record of all our individual projects, be it engaged research or research and publications or funded research. Anybody who's not involved in that slide so far are more than welcome. And what we're hoping is that we might have a template of about maybe 30, 35 individual contributions through social science to climate change research, and that we will make that available to the university as well. So anybody who hasn't got in yet, it's still an ongoing project that we'll add to. So do feel free to send us on that. The other slight change to the agenda is Rose Wall in the Coolock Law Centre, who is working in a couple of engaged research projects across things, can't be with us today. And we've asked Will Stringer in the Department of Anthropology to be in that panel in place of being on the last panel, just to even up the numbers on the panel and give more room for even kind of discussion. So that's about it. I don't know, Patrick, do you want to say?
No, I think that's about it. Thanks.
Yeah, there's more people due, obviously, you know, as the day goes on, and there's some undergraduate students due as well, which is great. And just to say, at 1:30 p.m, what we've imagined is a plenary discussion over lunch, which, you know, if the room is this full, might be more difficult than we think, but we would like to try and encourage people to get lunch, to come back in and to eat lunch over the continuation of the discussion, just to make use of the time we have, but we can see how things go. So for now, we're going to hand it over to panel one, and I'm going to ask Niamh Garvey to introduce that panel and to take it up. So it's Diarmuid and Jennie. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here for this exciting and important event. So I'm Niamh Garvey, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with the National Economic and Social Council. We're the national advisory body to the Taoiseach and government. So we're going to have two panellists today, and I'll introduce each one at a time then. So I invite maybe Professor Stevens to join us. So Professor Jennie Stevens is the Dean's Professor of Sustainability, Science and Policy at Northeastern University School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs in Boston. Before Northeastern, Professor Stevens was on the faculty at the University of Vermont and Clark University. She did postdoctoral research at Harvard's Kennedy School and has taught courses at Tufts, Boston University and MIT. And she earned her PhD at the California Institute of Technology in Environmental Science and Engineering and her BA at Harvard University in Environmental Science and Policy. Her research, teaching and community engagement focus on integrating transformative social justice, feminist, anti-racist perspectives into climate and energy policy, social and political aspects of fossil fuel phase-out, and the renewable energy transition. Professor Stevens is the Radcliffe Salata Climate Justice Fellow at Harvard, or was at 2023 to 24, the member of the New England Grist Fixer Network and the Climate Social Science Network, and was Leopold Leadership Fellow from 2015 to 16. And I'm delighted to announce today that Professor Stevens will be taking up the Sally Professorship in Icarus here in Maynooth next summer as Professor of Climate Change and Climate Justice. So thank you, Professor Stephen. Looking forward to it.
Thank you all. Great to be here. And what I thought my role today is to start things off is to give a very kind of macro perspective on why social science is so urgently needed in the climate space. And this is something I've been working on climate research my whole career, so about 30 years now. And originally my own background was in science and engineering, more of a technical perspective. And what I've learned throughout the time is that one of the reasons we've been so ineffective in climate is because we've had a narrow kind of technocratic scientific way of approaching the challenges and it not connecting sufficiently with social change, you know, basically. So, and issues of justice and equity. So what I'd like to do is just start us off with kind of a big picture perspective, thinking about climate justice and the urgent need for social science research in climate. So I want to begin by just saying that if we focus only on climate change as the problem, we limit what needs to change. And so I want to acknowledge climate justice activist and human rights lawyer Colette Chun-Battle, who says climate change is not the problem, it is a symptom of these systematic structural issues that are preventing us from having a healthy, just, equitable society. And climate change is a symptom of that. So we have to broaden the conversations, and especially now, here we are, 2023, and you know, we're going in the wrong direction on so many levels that we need to embrace this more transformative lens. Bigger picture, systemic change is what's needed. So many of you may have heard this word, polycrisis. But you know, we have mental health crisis, we have cost of living crisis, housing, food, energy, we have debt crisis, financial crisis, and then biodiversity crisis, plastic pollution crisis. Then we have horrible war and oppression. And then we have the climate crisis that is just exacerbating all of these other systemic challenges. So, and unfortunately, we have these mechanisms in society to try to address the challenges, but we've been completely insufficient and inadequate. We're actually going in the wrong direction in many respects. So carbon emissions continue to go up. The fossil fuel companies have no plans to stop extracting and the fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of those were also going in the wrong direction. And, you know, we have the COP going on right now, where we all see the powerful influence of the fossil fuel interests, and no real discussion about transformative change, which is so clearly needed. So the word that I have used in my own work is climate isolationism. When we think about climate change in a defined technocratic scientific way, we actually constrain ourselves. And so what I propose is we need to move from a climate isolationism framework to a climate justice framework. So climate isolationism is kind of this technocratic, quantitative, it's the mainstream way that climate change and climate policy is currently being discussed. It is very much about modeling and projections, emissions reductions. You know, greenhouse gas accounting is a big part of this view, which is important. I'm not saying that greenhouse gas emission reductions is not important, and decarbonization, very important. But we need to broaden beyond those narrow ways of thinking about how we're addressing climate. And technological fixes. So climate isolationism frames it as kind of a scientific problem that needs these technological responses. And we see that in the international climate negotiations. this push for investing in carbon storage technology, carbon removal technology, but not phasing out fossil fuels, which is, very clearly what is needed. So instead of climate isolationism, I think many of us and academics and social movements and people around the world in solidarity are calling for climate justice, which is much broader and a different framing, and it embraces transformative social change. It connects the climate crisis with social justice, economic justice, and racial justice. And it centers justice and equity and the needs of all people. So I wrote a book in 2020 called Diversifying Power: Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And in this book, and it's quite a kind of drawing from my own experiences in working in climate throughout my career, just recognizing how we need this broader conceptualization, but to get there, we need different people at the table, right? And different ideas and different, and we need people who are paying attention to, and we need to encourage everyone to pay attention to the power dynamics, right? And that's where feminist thinking, anti-colonial, anti-racist thinking, all of these perspectives are really just thinking about power. Who has power? How are we concentrating wealth and power versus distributing wealth and power? What are the problematic structures and systems that continue to perpetuate and advantage some and disadvantage others? And that's what this transformative climate justice perspective is all about. And the argument, if in a very kind of implementation sense, is that we will never be able to make the changes that are needed until and unless we broaden this perspective, we include more voices, and we connect the climate crisis with all the other social justice issues. So I want to propose that we think about research in terms of power and wealth in this kind of connected framework, and think about, I'm currently just finishing up a book called Climate Justice Universities, the transformative power of reimagining the transformative power of higher education. And in that, I'm really thinking about how knowledge and our research is connected to the changes, and some of our research is actually reinforcing the status quo, and how can we orient our research so it's more transformative? And to do that, I think we have to be very aware of how our research is connected to the power dynamics and the flow of money and finance and wealth. So I just want to mention here this Climate Social Science Network. It's an international network of scholars all around the world who are all exploring climate social science that in a way that does integrate this power perspective and with a justice lens, and it also is paying attention quite a bit to studying and trying to understand why certain powerful interests have so much power and influence and are resisting the changes that are needed. So I don't have time, and that isn't the point of this kind of discussion, to talk about the details of some of my own research, but I have done research in with a climate justice perspective, climate obstruction, which is those powerful interests that are obstructing the changes that are needed. I've done research on energy democracy, energy justice, renewable transformation, and also financial innovations that are needed for the transformations for climate justice. I want to introduce just one idea here about research in the social sciences. So we always hear about innovation. Everyone wants innovation. What I propose is we need ex-novation research, which is actually how do we stop doing the things that we know are not good, right? That they're counter to the goals that we have. But so two key areas, for an example, of exnovation research that we really are lacking in. There isn't very much research on how to phase out fossil fuels, on how we have a lot of research on plastics. There's plastics everywhere. The latest research says plastics are in our blood, in breast milk, like they're everywhere. Yet we have very little research on how to stop using plastics and how do we stop the system that just continues. And that is social science that's needed. And it's not the physical science. So I think exnovation research, how do we study big social change and transformation? But we focus so much on the new, right? Innovation. And the assumption with innovation research is that once you get something new, it will displace the old. But what we're seeing, especially in the energy space with renewable energy, you can push renewables all you want, but if you don't also phase out fossil fuels, you just have more energy total, right? And that's what the world is seeing right now. We have a lot of new renewables, which is great, but there's no plans there right now to actually phase out fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are such a versatile resource that until we actually focus on phasing out fossil fuels, they'll keep using them, and they'll keep being in the mix. So I think this is a specific idea and proposal there for exnovation research. So to sum up, and I want to kind of go through a few key points when we're thinking about this paradigm shift from climate isolationism, which is the mainstream way of thinking about climate, to a climate justice perspective. So and just quickly, I'm going to go through this list of things that we kind of need to shift. It's not saying that the things on the left are not important. It's saying what I'm saying is that we've been spent too much of our research on the things on the left, and we need to do more research on the more climate justice perspective. So the first one is individual behavior. There's a lot of research on how do we convince people, individuals, to make changes and put the responsibility and blame on people, an individual choice, and there's shaming and all kinds of things that go on there. And the point there is that a lot of people actually don't have that many choices, right? They're stuck in the system. They only have so much resource, so many decisions have to be made. What we really need is deeper systemic change. So we need to be doing more research on how collective action and community engaged, more broader systemic change, rather than focusing on how do we nudge individuals' behavior. And again, it's not to say there isn't room for that. It's still important, but we need more on this side. Technological change versus social change. So much of climate research is focused on technologies. If you look at the amount of money and research funding that goes to climate research, a lot of it is in technological change. Again, it's important, there's a role for it, but we need so much more research on social change and social innovation as well as technological. A shift in priorities in terms of profit-seeking priorities versus well-being. We have the health of our own health as human beings, the health of the planet. The narrow thinking and orientation toward always maximizing profit is just obviously contributing to the narrow approach to climate as well. As I mentioned, this shift to have exnovation research as well as innovation research. Another really important thing is our financial systems that are focused on concentrating wealth and power. If you look at the numbers in terms of inequities and disparities and climate vulnerabilities, it's just getting worse and worse, right? And the number of billionaires versus people who are in very precarious economic situations. So we have these systems of economic financial systems that are just concentrating wealth and power, creating more vulnerability. And we really need to figure out how to change the economic and financial systems so that we can distribute wealth and power instead. This whole idea of wealth accumulation is just kind of assumed in so many of individually, organizationally, but we need more thinking about sufficiency, like what's enough, and then then moving more toward collective rather than individual or organizational maximization of wealth all the time. And then finally, this kind of assumption that of linearity, I think, is pervasive, right? That like, oh, this is the way it's been, so we'll just continue on this. We're at a point in human history and in the Earth's climate history that things are not linear. Big changes are happening in a time scale that is unprecedented if we look at the record. So we know that we can't just make assumptions of any pattern that it's just going to keep going that way, right? Like we know there's breaking points, there's planetary boundaries, there's limits, physical limits, and so we need to start connecting things more explicitly in a complex systems way. So I'll end there and just appreciate many of the students and collaborators that I've been working with. And I also just want to acknowledge the Maynooth University mission or purpose is to imagine and create better futures for all, which is very much aligned with a climate justice perspective. And so it's really an invitation to all of us to embrace this more broader vision and opportunity for climate research. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Stevens. I think that was a really powerful presentation. And personally, I was just really struck by the idea of the ex-innovation research. It's a new term for me. I think it was great challenges to us here in the room as researchers, and I expect we'll have a really rich discussion. I'm looking forward to that. But first, I'm going to introduce our second keynote this morning. So we have Dr. Diarmuid Torney, who is the Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University and co-director of the DCU Centre for Climate and Society. Dr. Torney holds an MPhil and DPhil in International Relations from the University of Oxford, and his research focuses on climate change politics and governance at national, EU and global levels, with a particular interest in governance frameworks to enable transformative climate action, including deliberative democracy and framework climate legislation. Dr. Torney is the lead author of Ireland's first climate change assessment, commissioned by the Environment Protection Agency here, and programme chair of DCU's MSc in Climate Change Policy, Media and Society. I'm delighted to note that Dr. Torney is an independent expert member of the National Economic and Social Council, which I sit on the Secretariat, and he's also a member of the executive group of the All Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network, member of the Expert Working Group on Sustainability of Chartered Accountants in Ireland, member of the Net Zero Working Group of the and two more, Climate Change Biodiversity and a research fellow of the Earth Systems Governance Project. So many accolades.
Okay. Thanks very much, Niamh, for that very comprehensive introduction. If you'd asked me for a bio, I might have sent a slightly shorter one. But delighted, great to see such a full room. And thanks very much, Mary, for the invitation to join you. And delighted to share a stage with a platform with Jennie Stevens, and welcome back to Ireland. So Mary asked me to speak about, or at least I think the brief was to speak about what we have been doing in DCU in terms of trying to platform social science research. At least I hope I understood the brief correctly, and hopefully it also dovetails with Jennie's excellent presentation. So I'm going to, I guess, dwell a bit less on that bigger picture question about the importance of social science. I will start off with some remarks around that, but I'll talk a bit about the journey we've been on. Everyone seems to be on a journey these days in DCU within our Centre for Climate and Society, and then finish up with maybe some remarks around the role that I can see colleagues in Maynooth taking up in this space. One slight correction on Niamh's introduction. Apart from the the excessive length was, I think you said I was the lead author on the Irish climate change assessment report. Given that there's another lead author in the room, I'm sure Conor Murphy and Peter Thorne, also from this parent, was the lead author. I was one of many lead authors. So you can see I titled my contribution there as a social scientist. And I wanted to start off, some of you might be familiar with this paper by Overland and Tubical from 2018. You can see the title there kind of gives the game away, the misallocation of climate research funding. And according to their research between 1990 and 2018, the natural and technical sciences received 770% more funding than the social sciences research on issues related to climate change, and only 0.12% of all research spending was spent on the social science of climate mitigation. Now, if you were, or if an alien from Mars descended on Earth and looked at this, not knowing anything about the characteristics of climate change, I think this would strike them as odd. So that's discounting even if you don't agree with anything that Jennie has said. This still looks like a really odd distribution of research funding. Of course, I don't discount anything that Jennie said, but this is, and obviously this is only up to 5 years ago. But it really is a stark illustration of the historical funding priorities around climate change. So, I mean, I won't go over this in too much detail because Jennie has already covered this territory very, very well. So we need societal support. We need to understand how societies respond or don't to climate change. Really, the centrality of questions of equity, justice, and distribution, all of those themes that Jennie talked about, and the importance of understanding agents and processes of change, and also importantly, resistance to change. Jennie talked about that very cogently. But the focus of research here in Ireland, and the focus, I think, of funding priorities, though it is changing, remains on STEM approaches to climate change research. I say it is changing, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end, because I think there is a growing recognition of the importance of social science research on climate and other environmental topics. And that's an opportunity for those of you in the room and those of us across the higher education institutions and beyond in shaping future research priorities. So just to give you an introduction to the Centre for Climate and Society, if you're looking closely, so I went looking for a photo of our membership, and I realized we're not very good at taking photos of ourselves. If you look closely, someone's actually wearing a mask. My colleague Marcus Towley towards the back left, and that's an illustration that this isn't a particularly recent photo, but this was one of our members' meetings, and I was struck. I think it was Mary in her. You were talking about those case studies, and you mentioned a figure of 30 or 35. And that's roughly what we have in DCU. We've I checked on our centre website yesterday. We have 31 faculty members, we have 2 centre staff, 8 affiliated researchers. So these are, a lot of them are people who were once upon a time in DCU or attached to DCU, but are now elsewhere. We have 15 PhD students, and we're growing. But really the inspiration or the origins for our Centre for Climate and Society came about, I mean, not exactly from a meeting like this, but from a growing realization that there was a critical mass of us in DCU interested in, very broadly speaking, social science and humanities approaches to studying climate change and other environmental issues. So we didn't quite convene a meeting like this, but it grew from a series of conversations that we we had with each other. So the centre has been in existence for, I think, about 2 years now, for reasons that are best known to our Vice President for Research. We have had to go through the process of reapplying for our existence in the last few months. All research centres in DCU have been made to go through this process. We haven't yet heard the outcome of this process, so hopefully we will continue to exist. I have a sneaking suspicion that the university won't shut us down, but fingers crossed. So in terms of how we set ourselves up, we were challenged by our advisory board. I think at the advisory board's first meeting, and Niamh's colleague Jean Moore is on our one of the members of our advisory board. You know, I mentioned this because it might be helpful for you to think about this as well. At our first centre advisory board meeting, our advisory board collectively said, "What's your theory of change?" We didn't have an immediate answer, you know, and I think it was very much implicit in our thinking, but we didn't have a clearly articulated theory of change. So we did get together over the course of half a day in August of last year, August 2022, with an external facilitator to try and think through what it is we're trying to achieve and how we think we're going to achieve that. And there were really interesting conversations on the day. So the facilitator got us to do agree, disagree is the name of the exercise, where you have a question, you have 2 statements in response to a question, and you have to physically arrange yourselves in a line from one side of the room to the other. And so she did that with a number of different questions, but the one that sticks in my mind was around whether we saw ourselves as ivory tower academics is the wrong term, but you know, academics somewhat detached from society, or as activists. And the interesting thing was that each of us, you know, we didn't all cluster in one space, and it prompted really, and the purpose of that exercise is to prompt discussions among people. So you know, you talk to the person next to you about why exactly you're standing this side of them rather than the other. And my main takeaway from that was that we were a quite diverse, you know, in terms of mindset, a quite diverse group of people. I mean, none of us was at either end of that spectrum. I think we were kind of heading towards the activist end of the spectrum, but with some differences between us. But as a result of our discussions on the day, we came up with this mission statement that our mission is to shape and support societal response to climate change in Ireland and around the world through high quality research and expertise. And we identified, I mean, these won't come as a revelation to you. We identified 3 pillars of our work: research, education, and engagement. And I'll just give a couple of a flavor of what some of these look like. So this is on the research side. Because I thought Rose Wall was going to be here, I had to mention the research we did with community law and mediation on environmental justice and vulnerable and marginalized communities. So that's just one example of research. But also, and this comes back to, excuse me, I think the part of the rationale for establishing a visible cluster of research is that in the new Climate Plus SFI co-centre, so this is the tri-jurisdictional climate centre that was announced by Minister Simon Harris last week. So Maynooth is involved in this, but principally, I think Conor, you're involved, and Peter Thorne are involved, but having the DCU Centre for Climate and Society positioned us quite well to take on a significant role in the social science side of this. We've also recently got funding for a Horizon Europe project on climate change and democratic governance that I'll be coordinating. And the interesting thing about this Horizon Europe call is that it arose not in Cluster 5, which is the climate, energy and mobility part of Horizon Europe. It arose in Cluster 2, which is the creative and inclusive society. I'm getting the title slightly wrong, but it's an example of where climate is cropping up in other areas of research. So that was, that's broadly the institutions and social science part of Horizon Europe, but it was a specific call about climate change, just to emphasize, the opportunities and I think how that funding landscape is changing for the better. In terms of education, so we have these three pillars: research, education, and engagement. But we see them as deeply interconnected. And in a way, actually, the Centre for Climate and Society grew out of our MSc in climate change, which we set up in the first intake of students in 2018. And I was just speaking yesterday morning at a business in the community event, and so it was their end of the year look back event. And I was pleased to see that 3 of our graduates from the program were there as sustainability officers in companies that are members of business in the community. These are some photos from our alumni events. And then engagement, I don't know if I'm kind of like a stuck record these days. I was involved in designing and running Ireland's Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss that met over 2 weekends in October 2022, and it ran alongside the Adults Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. We brought together 35 children and young people randomly selected from across Ireland. And again, coming to the interconnection, I put this in the engagement box, but there's an element obviously of education to this, and there's also an element of research. We have a research component built in around this. And I guess this comes to themes of engaged research, which I think is very much in the ethos of what a lot of you are doing. But just to give you a flavour of what it looked like, and with no disrespect, I know you were on the expert advisory group for the Adult Citizens Assembly. There was a nature walk, but it was mostly sitting in a hotel room. I like to think ours was a lot more fun than the Citizens Assembly for children and young people. So with lots of games and activities, and importantly, actually, we co-designed the whole structure of the assembly with a young advisory team of 9 children and young people aged 8 at the time, 8 to 16. This was the highlight of everyone's weekend, when getting outside in nature. An important principle was giving a voice to children and young people, and I think that this photograph with Elsie is the name of the girl there with the microphone in her hand kind of illustrates that. There was also an important process of speaking to decision makers. So that's Minister Malcolm Noonan, who came to receive their calls to action on the final day of their second weekend. And then fast forward to just a couple of weeks ago, this is a session of the Joint Office Committee on Environment and Climate Action. So we brought 6 of the children and young people in, and this girl here is Elsie, who you saw in one of the previous photographs with the microphone in her hand. So there's an important part of giving voice to children and young people and allowing them to speak truth to power. Just to finish up then, I wanted to come back to the climate change assessment report that I mentioned at the beginning. So it's not yet published. The whole 4 volumes will hopefully be published in early in the new year. but this is volume 4. So I was a lead author on volume 4, and I don't know, can you see it from the back of the room, but the title was Realizing the Benefits of Transition and Transformation. So this whole volume was really about how we get there, how we achieve transformative change. And I picked out 2 quotes here, but before commenting on them, just to explain the process, the 4 volumes were commissioned by the Environment Protection Agency, and the lead in the EPA was Frank McGovern, who's Ireland's representative at the IPCC. And so the process was modelled to a large extent on the IPCC process, which is to say that in this summary for policymakers, every word and every comma and every full stop is signed off by government, which is, you know, at times painful and frustrating process, but it also adds weight to the words that end up in these summaries for policymakers. It's also being seen, the output of this assessment report is being seen by government, I understand, as setting a research agenda for the future of climate change research. And so in that context, I just wanted to call out, I could have picked any number of quotes from it, but you can see that the first one is social and cultural transformation is required to create a sustainable society. In the second quote, we call out status quo and many potential enablers of transformative change across economy, innovation. Sorry, Jennie, the word innovation is still there. Finance, policy, governance, and society that are currently insufficiently configured for climate action and sustainable development. And coming back to the importance of social science, we won't know how to reconfigure those without social science research. And I think, I don't know most of you in the room, but I know a small number of you. And from knowing what I know about your research, I can see very clearly aspects of this research agenda where researchers here in Maynooth can play a leading role in responding to this research call. And I hope that each of you in the room can see yourself somewhere in that research agenda. I can certainly see the work of Jennie in that in the years to come. So I'll leave it there. Mary, hopefully that was roughly what you had in mind, and thanks again for the invitation.
So great, I might invite you both to come up. So thanks, Diarmuid. That was really great to hear more about the centre and, you know, potentially some useful experiences for thinking here in Maynooth. I was really struck also by that second quote of the status quo as a powerful constraint against transformative change, and maybe some of the links there with Jennie's emphasis on the importance of power and resistance. But I'd say we're all really keen to get stuck into some discussion. So I think we have till about 12, like half 12, before we move into the next panel. So about 20 minutes for discussion. So yeah, I'll just open it up to the floor. Maybe say your name or your organisation and introduce yourself briefly before your question would be great. So we've got a sense of who's in the room. And yeah, over to the audience.
My name is Msetfi, Prof. Sociology here. And I just, I agree with everything that's said, but I have one sort of ongoing concern. And let me see if I can express this the best way. This notion, I think both of you agree, this notion of power and the status quo. And I believe it is ideological, but it's also institutional. And when you put forward an alternative, you need to actually get that in practice going. And in this particular society that we are here in, it's very difficult to find an institution that can take on and transform this society in the way we would like it, as you know, a critique of climate change. And I think, you know, that's a major weakness from the ivory tower that we all inhabit, you know. And just a second thing, two other points that are slightly controversial. Jennie, when I said to you, it's the best summary I've ever come across of what I would call eco-socialism, you know, advocating really radical change across all aspects of of society. And I think that, and that was, fantastic. Concerning a question here and a slightly weird sort of thing, you sort of push down the idea of the natural walk with regard to these people here, that it was held in the hotel. Wouldn't it be fantastic if they had a natural walk within a built environment, like a room? Because nature isn't just out there, it's here. Everything here, including ourselves, has come from nature, and we're going to go back to it. And, I think we need to overcome that sort of dichotomy that nature is green, that it's part of products, and everything in this room, everything from the computer, ourselves, are part of nature. So it would have been a fascinating walk, I think, intellectually. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think first comment maybe to both of you, and then there was one each. But Jennie, do you want to go first on the overall one, and then?
Yeah, sure. So I would say yes to institutional change, and it's very hard, as you said. And I think, there's this research coming out of the Netherlands, like the socio-technical transitions research, how big social change happens. And not only from the Netherlands, but that's the origin of that. And one of the things that is really important in that kind of conceptualization of how change happens is it has to happen simultaneously, multiple levels and multiple scales, from small scale, local, individual, organizational, institutional, then status quo, macro kind of regime change, plus these big disruptions in kind of society-wide things. And when there's alignment among all is when big transformation can actually happen. And so again, it's hard for all of us, any of us, to project or predict how or when that can happen. But I think we're in this time where it's inevitable that we can't just keep going the way we are going. So, I think part of the work we can do is kind of prepare for that potential for transformation, work toward that, right? With these ideals. And obviously, people can say that I'm naive or utopian to have this vision of something very different, right? But that's kind of part of the work of social change. The theory of change is to have an imagination and a vision of something different, right? And you have to have that to orient and the work and the struggle and the so there's so I agree, like institutional change is really, really hard. And just because it's hard doesn't mean, we still have to work toward it, right? So I don't know if that's kind of how I would think to respond to that.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how close I need to be to this yet. I agree with everything Jennie said. Coming back to your comment about the status quo, I'm not sure how much I'm supposed to talk about the process, the approval process, but there was an awful lot of resistance to including that word status quo. And we really fought to have it included because we thought it's a really important message. And if you are ignoring the power of the status quo, then you're misdiagnosing the problem. But I think that goes, Eamon, to the crux of your question, which is around institutional resistance. And like Jennie said, it's not going to be easy, but I think there is a really powerful role for the humanities and social sciences in trying to imagine alternative futures and in trying to look at those multiple levels at the seeds of change, and sometimes they come from unexpected places. But I think one other thing that makes it difficult is that we tend to be better at spotting social change, large-scale social change in the rear view mirror. It's harder to predict in advance. It's much easier, obviously, by definition, to see when it's already happened. And then just to come to your second question, and Mary, again, the Citizens Assembly for the Adult Population on Biodiversity Law was a very rich and engaging process, and there was a day trip where you went to Dublin Port, a nature reserve, and I'm forgetting the third. Oh, Bull Island. And I went on the trip as well. But I think, Eamon, your question about seeing, if you like, the embedded nature, the embodied nature in all of the physical objects around us is a really important point. And it reminds me, just yesterday I was reading, I think it's called Down to Earth. It's the Guardian's weekly newsletter, and they were reporting on having done a nature footprint or a biodiversity footprint of their own activities. So they commissioned researchers in the University of Oxford, and I can't remember the name of the journalist who was writing yesterday's newsletter, but it was words to the effect that, you know, some staff in the Guardian expected it to be all about tree planting, but actually it was about the ways in which the day-to-day activities of the Guardian are dependent on nature in all sorts of invisible ways. So I think that's a really important point.
Thank you. Conscious of time, so I'm going to take maybe three. There's a lady here, then in the middle, and there's a gentleman over them on the other side. We might take three together. Again, if you could introduce yourself and maybe keep it, but if it's a comment, kind of a short one.
I feel like I'm on the Late Show or something with this mic. I don't even know if it's working. It is. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much to both of you. Yeah, I don't want to be pessimistic, Jenny. I think my question really is to you. I mean, for me, probably the most important and profound statement that was made on climate justice recently was blah, blah, blah by Greta Thunberg. I just think she absolutely was on point with what we need to be saying all the time. And I guess it's just, you know, how do we convince people that socialism are not the radical ideas, that it's what we have, I'm speaking for myself, it's what we have now is radical. It's the, you know, how much liberal democracy has failed us. You know, we have a US president, you know, overseeing genocide in the Middle East, not being called out sufficiently for it. I just get so frustrated even here now. It's so important, but everybody in this room probably agrees with each other. I mean, how do we break this idea that our ideas are radical and that to continue voting for the status quo is the sensible option? I know this is a big question, but it's for all of us, I think.
Thank you.
Hi, Karen Till, Geography at Maynooth, and thank you so much for starting off today's event with such important discussions. Can you, following up on the past two questions, maybe give us a personal story of what language, what strategies you used when engaging governments, big, you know, universities, institutions? I think that many of us in the room are trying to do different things in our classrooms, in, you know, pedagogically, even in our research, but the barriers to change are extreme. And just as a little example, it took the Athena Swan process in the UK based upon an MIT study, which came here kicking and screaming. It is not perfect, but in an important way to acknowledge gender inequality. It was coming from above, forcing universities to make the change. And when I mean above, it was the funders. So, you know, like your opening slide, it's speaking also to many of the challenges and constraints we have in our own research. Is there something like that we could do? I mean, so if there's any concrete specific examples or ideas that might accelerate change at that higher level based upon your own great experiences, we're all ears. Thanks.
And then the third person, gentleman over on the far side there.
Thank you, Rory Hearn, Department of Applied Social Studies here in Maynooth. Thank you so much for the presentations. In part, my question was following on and comment was following on from the previous questions as well. And thinking about it, you know, my work around housing and inequality, I think that unless social justice is absolutely central to the climate advocacy policy, it is not going to win the hearts and minds of the people, because you know, the famous phrase, how can you think about the end of the world when you can't think about the end of the week? You know, people are being evicted into homelessness, people can't get a home, and they're, you know, how are they to think about climate? And it's connected directly, I think, with the political change, because when we look at the rise of the far right in Europe and the rise of this anti-climate agenda, it is being fed by people's sense of social exclusion. Nobody's speaking to them, nobody's standing up for them. So I think there's something for me in the change around climate change. We have to be rooted in social movements for social justice, campaigns for social justice, and us being, as researchers, advocates in the public sphere, being part of them in bringing that change. Because if it is the crisis we say it is, if it's the transformation is needed, we need to be on the front lines. That's my view anyway. Thanks.
Great question. Sorry, Camilla.
We have an online question as well, like.
Yes, one, sure.
Okay.
I think we should have time, so we might take the three and then we'll come back to the online, and if there's any others as well, we can take online. So yeah, own experience maybe in engagement from Camilla. Is there anything like the Athena's one on diversity and inclusion that could be applied in this area? And then I guess our own rootedness maybe in social movements. Yeah, Diarmuid, do you want to go
Sure, yeah. So Camilla, starting off with your question, and your comment that we all agree with each other in the room. I think that's a very valid observation. It reminds me of Seamus Boland, the head of Irish Rural Link, kind of a network of a civil society coalition, who says, I'm paraphrasing now, but he said, if everyone in the room thinks like you, you're probably in the wrong room. Which I think is a good way of capturing that idea, and I think it's probably, it means it's incumbent on all of us to keep talking to each other, but also to get out of this room and talk to our colleagues in our faculties, in our departments, and elsewhere, and then maybe linking that to Karen's question about engaging with government. So I guess my most powerful, I think actually Niamh probably might have some remarks on that from both your background of working, you were with Trócaire previously, and in your current role with NESC. So the Children and Young People's Assembly has been my most, I guess, it's not me speaking, but giving a platform for the children and young people, and that is both for me a positive story, but also a cautionary tale, because it really took this whole idea from the start was Minister Malcolm Noonan's idea. He came to the academic community with the request that someone would design and run this process. His department funded it, and he has really championed it. He came, I didn't mention it, but he came back a year later to our reunion. We had a one-year reunion in October, and he came back to report back to the children, providing accountability on what he had done with their ideas. But I'm not sure would his department have done that in the absence of him. So I think it comes to the importance of individuals. I guess what I'm saying is it was a particular set of circumstances rather than a universal model that is applicable. And then just to come on to Rory's question at the end, I mean, I think I would be of a similar view to you, but coming back to that exercise that I talked about in our centre workshop, one of the things where we were asked to place ourselves on a spectrum, one of the things I took from that was that there was a diversity of opinion on exactly that question you raised within my own colleagues, and I would be wary of, I think some of my colleagues wouldn't, would be uncomfortable describing themselves in the terms that you described themselves. And I would be wary of kind of, trying to shame them or pressure them into doing something that's very far outside their comfort zone. Because I think each of us, depending on our own kind of philosophy and our own theory of change, can play a role. So I would be slightly cautious about saying that that's, that is the model for all academics, even if I kind of personally agree with you.
Jennie, any reflections on that? Right?
Yeah, so a few points I think that might be worth addressing. I think one of the things that I think is critical is to avoid worsening polarization, right? And that's what obviously in the United States is happening, and it's getting worse by the day. And universities are under attack and being threatened, and intimidating things are happening in the United States in universities. So I think centering justice is does offer, a grounding universal appeal, I think, and then academic work that is co-created, co-designed, engaged with communities, and not this, to avoid universities and the work going on at universities being seen as, elite or out of touch or separate from what's happening I think is something that is very important. And I think here in Ireland, because it's smaller country, I think there's more connections, anyway. And so, but I think that's a really important kind of lens to keep in mind. In terms of personal examples, I mean, I think I get a lot of inspiration through the work with students, and students bringing the, important questions and engagement and as you mentioned, Greta Thunberg, like youth movement throughout the world. And I think we in our universities can, I mean, obviously we support and engage with that. But to your question, I mean, how it is, as you said, it's the big question that we're all facing. But I do think that, there's no such thing as being apolitical, right? To your point, Rory, of just no matter what we do, we are engaging or not. I mean, that's a choice, right? And so I think there are a lot of opportunities for more direct engagement, and as you said, it's not necessarily for everyone, but there's so much. And I think one of the premise of the book that I'm writing is that universities are actually under-leveraged resource for societal transformation and change. And so I think that speaks to your point of there's so much, there are new and different ways that we can and we have the opportunity to engage differently. So those are just some thoughts. Yeah.
I think we have about 2 minutes left at the very end. So I know we have a question or possibly two online.
It's just the one. Yeah, it's from John Barry in Queen's University Belfast. How and what ways does higher education need to change across research, education, outreach, and engagement so they're fit for future purpose?
That maybe is going to take a big answer, which I'll hand over in your concluding statements then maybe, as I hand back to you to answer that question. I might throw one in as well, but maybe it's for our lunchtime plenary. But Diarmuid mentioned in a previous role, I worked more on the advocacy space, so maybe as an activist side, and just that idea of we're all on the same page. I'm kind of aware maybe in the climate movement, even quite recently, divisions, let's say, on issues around the Middle East, so do we have to agree on everything to act on some issue? Do you know where people's perception of justice might mean very specific things across a whole range of issues, but there might be disagreements with it. So just maybe some reflection on that, but we could hold that for the lunchtime if we're over time, but you might respond to the question from John Barry, please.
Well, you're about to publish a book on it, so maybe you're...
Well, there's so much to say here, and I think the, ex-novation research is one idea, more focused on some of the other ideas about connecting with, not just connecting with community, but changing the frame of regenerative economy. Another idea is unlearning, right? Like actually recognizing that there's so many things that we just kind of assume, or that our universities are teaching students, that actually doesn't make any sense in terms of what's actually happening with the climate crisis. And that particularly in neoliberal economics, thinking about, this growth paradigm continuing perpetually, like with planetary boundaries, there's, it doesn't make sense, yet we're continuing to teach students in that way. So, I mean, there's lots of other things I could say, but I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I maybe won't dwell on the specifics. John, thanks for the question. But just to say that I think within each of our institutions, we're facing similar struggles and facing similar resistance from whether it's colleagues or senior management or different constellations of interest. And I think that calls for those of us who are of like mind to connect with each other. And John, apologies, I was sick the day of your event in Galway a month or two ago. But John and a colleague in the University of Galway brought together a group of people from across the universities on the island of Ireland to address precisely that question. I think there are future events, one in March next year in Queens, as far as I understand. So I think that's a really good opportunity for us to continue to work with each other. And if I've 10 seconds, I just wanted to come back on what Jennie said about the question of scale. So, compared to larger countries, in terms of networks of policymakers, the access that we potentially have, the influence we have, I spent some time in the UK with a much bigger system, and I think sometimes we don't understand or we don't appreciate the benefits that come from being based in a small country where the number of people you have to convince of a new idea is probably a lot smaller than in a larger country. So I just want to pick up on that point.
It's probably a nice positive note to end on then, and encourage one. So thank you to our panelists. Hopefully we're just handing over to Paddy just a couple of minutes late. So I think we're moving on to our second panel now. So thank you very much.
This panel is on public engagement, and I think our reason for having a session specifically on public engagement was to not only sort of show some of the great work that various former students and colleagues of Maynooth are involved in with different sort of community initiatives, but also because that term public engagement is often bandied around or used a lot, but it can obscure as much as it can reveal. So I think often public engagement, and I'm thinking about filling out applications and like job promotions things, it's like the public engagement is working with industry. So it could be working with Intel to develop a new product. or it is interfacing with policymakers and government is the other big one. And those are the two that get most credit and visibility, and where the institution, going back to thinking about the university institution, sort of puts most weight and value. But there's a whole other range of forms of public engagement with social movements, with whether tenants unions, trade unions, with community organizations, NGOs, in community wealth building, diverse economies, even as academics being in the kind of public domain, going on TV shows, writing newspaper articles. That's all public engagement that doesn't get so much recognition. So I think it's very important that we identify that and sort of amplify it. So we've got really good speakers. Thanks for coming. I might introduce all of you. There's 4 of you. I might introduce all of you, and then you can just come up one after the other. So to start, we have Vanessa Conroy and Colette McEntee from Feminist Communities for Climate Justice, which is a relatively new organization, maybe a few months. And I don't know a huge amount about your work, so I'm looking forward to it. Then we will have Caitlin Armstrong, who is the project director with Spark, which is, again, I might not be getting this exactly right, but it's a climate cooperative with Bohemians Football Club in Phibsborough. So a really innovative kind of project. I know a little bit about what they're doing. And Caitlin was also a former MA student here in anthropology. And then we have Tom McDonnell, who's from the Nevin Economic Research Institute, who also has an affiliation with Maynooth. And then finally, we have Will Stringer, who's doing a PhD in anthropology, who I think is going to talk more about interdisciplinarity. You got kind of seconded onto this panel, so it might be slightly different. So I'll hand it over to you two, and thanks very much.
Yeah, for me. Okay, yes, so I'm Colette McEntee, and I'm working alongside Vanessa on the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice project. And it's a joint project between the National Women's Council and Community Work Ireland. And it's funded under the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications under the Community Climate Action Programme. So it's all about learning by doing. And I think yourselves, Caitlin, Spark is funded under the same stream. There's loads of really cool projects under that strand too. And so I definitely encourage you all to look it up, because yeah, it's really inspiring and motivating. So the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice project, it actually came about nearly as a response. Community Work Ireland and could see that there was community workers on the ground that didn't know, I suppose, how to communicate comfortably or confidently about the climate crisis, and it was coming up, and they could see that there was interconnections and overlaps. And so this is kind of a response to that, this project. And then they merged with, obviously, the National Women's Council. And the National Women's Council, I should say, is a membership organisation which Community Work Ireland is a member of. But then Community Work Ireland themselves is also a membership organisation of community workers, and they're all about supporting them to, suppose, advance policy making, and they're